Most men spend their lives chasing success. Silas Thorne caught it, and found it was hollow. On the night the rain came down like shattered glass, he would discover a forgotten part of himself, and take the first step toward a life he never knew he still wanted. The rain hit Silas Thorne's office window so hard it sounded like 1,000 tiny fists. Outside, the city was nothing more than a blurred watercolor of gray buildings and flashing car lights. Inside, Silas sat in his expensive leather chair, surrounded by polished mahogany and shelves lined with awards and ledgers. It was everything a successful man was supposed to have. But as he looked at his reflection in the glass, he saw not a victor, but a stranger. His face carried lines not of laughter, but of stress. His name on the door, Thorne Financial Holdings, felt less like a proud statement and more like a gravestone. Silas had done everything society told him to do. Work hard, be smart, build wealth. He had climbed the ladder, but at the top, he found nothing but cold wind. Somewhere along the way, the young man who once dreamed of music, poetry, and adventure had disappeared. Those dreams were now buried under meetings, deadlines, and profit reports. He wondered if it was too late to change, if at 57, the road ahead was already set in stone. But somewhere deep inside, a tiny voice still whispered, a voice he had been ignoring for years. One rainy evening, while sorting through his late father's belongings, Silas found a small, water-stained notebook. He expected financial records or family documents, but when he opened it, his breath caught. Inside, in his own handwriting from decades ago, were poems. The pages were filled with clumsy, heartfelt verses about sunsets, oceans, and chasing dreams. Reading them was like stepping into another life, a life he had abandoned. The words pulled at something deep inside him. They reminded him of a time when he believed in endless possibilities, when his heart beat faster at the thought of exploring the unknown. Sitting under the dim glow of his banker's lamp, Silas felt a warmth spread through him. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was recognition. He realized that somewhere along the way, he had traded his compass for a clock. He was still alive, but he wasn't living. That night, the thought refused to leave him. What if it's not too late? Silas didn't start with a grand plan. Instead, he took one small, almost invisible step. He signed up for a night class in creative writing. Felt ridiculous at first. Sitting in a room full of students young enough to be his children, he wondered if he was making a fool of himself. His hands trembled when he read aloud his first short paragraph. His voice cracked. But when he finished, the class clapped softly. For the first time in years, Silas felt alive. That night, as he walked to his car, he noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The way streetlights glowed like golden halos, the sound of rain dripping from rooftops, the smell of fresh bread from a bakery still open late. He realized how much of life he had ignored in his rush to build an empire. The first step had been taken, and even though it was small, it was enough to change everything. One Saturday morning, Silas found himself sitting by the large oak tree outside his office. He had passed it every day for years without a second glance, but now he took out a sketchbook and began to draw. His lines were shaky, his proportions uneven, but it didn't matter. The act of creating, of truly seeing, felt like a quiet rebellion against the life that had trapped him. As he sketched, a woman from the nearby cafe brought him a cup of coffee. She said she had noticed him sitting there the last few days. They spoke for a few minutes about the weather, the tree, and the best places to watch the sunset in the city. It was a simple, human moment, one that had nothing to do with business or profit. Silas realized that these small connections were just as important as any deal he had ever made. The transformation wasn't easy. Silas still ran his company, and the old habits came back quickly. On some days, the stock market would dip, and the familiar wave of anxiety would rise in his chest. Voices from his past, colleagues, family, even his own, whispered that he was being foolish, that his creative pursuits were a waste of time. But when doubt crept in, Silas would open the notebook. He would read one of his old poems, then write a new one beside it, as if having a conversation with his younger self. He began to understand that responsibility wasn't just about money and business. It was also about taking care of the part of yourself that makes you feel alive. And for Silas, that part had been ignored for far too long. Silas began to change his daily habits in small, deliberate ways. Instead of rushing from home to the office, he started leaving 30 minutes earlier so he could walk part of the way. The city, once a blur from behind tinted car windows, became a living, breathing landscape. He noticed the baker sweeping the sidewalk, the old man feeding pigeons, the children chasing each other to school. These details stitched color back into the fabric of his days. At work, he moved a small drafting table into the corner of his office, next to the window. During breaks, instead of checking stock prices, he would sketch or write. At first, his assistant raised an eyebrow, but over time she stopped asking questions. Silas felt lighter, not because his responsibilities were gone, but because they no longer consumed every corner of his life. For the first time in decades, he looked forward to the quiet moments in between. One evening, Silas pulled out a box of old addresses, friends, colleagues, and people he hadn't spoken to in years. Many of those connections had faded, not because of fights, but because life had gotten in the way. He bought a pack of thick, cream-colored stationery and began writing letters. Not emails, not messages, real letters in his own handwriting. Some were short, simple acknowledgments of time past. Others were long, detailed memories of shared moments. He didn't write expecting replies. He wrote because he wanted to put warmth back into the world. Few people responded with surprise and joy. Others remained silent. But Silas didn't mind. The act itself felt like planting seeds, knowing not all would grow, but some would. The local community art center had always been just a building Silas passed on his way to work. Now, one afternoon, he found himself stepping inside. The place buzzed with energy. Children painting, teenagers rehearsing lines from a play, and elderly people working on pottery. A volunteer coordinator asked if he wanted to help. To her surprise, Silas said yes. He began by listening to the children tell their fantastical stories. Pirates made of clouds, dragons that baked bread, robots who fell in love. Their imaginations were wild and unafraid. Silas realized that their stories reflected something he had lost, the ability to dream without limits. Week by week, he became more than just a helper. He became part of their creative world. One day, a young boy at the art center looked up from his drawing and asked, "Mr. Thorne, what did you want to be when you were my age?" The question hit Silas harder than he expected. He paused, staring at the child's wide eyes, and finally answered, "I wanted to write poems, and maybe travel the world." The boy grinned. "So why don't you?" Silas laughed awkwardly, giving the usual adult answer about work and responsibilities. But the truth stuck with him all night. Why didn't he? The boy's innocent question had stripped away the excuses he'd been hiding behind for decades. It was one thing to rediscover his passion. It was another to actually live it. From that day forward, Silas started taking detours on his way home. He wandered into neighborhoods he had never visited, stopped at small coffee shops, and lingered in bookstores until closing time. One evening, he found a narrow street where lanterns hung from every doorway, casting a golden glow over the cobblestones. Felt like stepping into another time. He sat at an outdoor table, sipping tea and writing in his notebook. There was no rush, no phone buzzing for his attention, just the quiet hum of life around him. Silas realized he was building something new. Not a company, not an investment, but a collection of moments that made him feel alive. An old business associate invited Silas to a high-profile investor dinner. The room glittered with expensive suits, polished shoes, and the low murmur of deals being made. Once, Silas would have thrived here, but now he felt like an outsider. The conversations were all about profits, losses, and future mergers. When asked what he had been working on lately, Silas surprised himself. Instead of talking about the company, he said, "I've been writing." The table fell silent for a moment, Then someone chuckled as if it were a joke. Silas smiled politely, but inside he felt a quiet pride. He no longer needed their approval to validate his choices. Weeks later, one of Silas's poems was accepted by a small local journal. It wasn't a big publication, but when he saw his words in print, he felt the same thrill he imagined young poets must feel. He didn't use his real name. Instead, he signed it with a pen name, wanting the work to stand on its own. He bought 5 copies of the journal and kept one in his office drawer. Whenever the day felt heavy, he would pull it out, reminding himself that he was more than a businessman. He was creating something that would outlast quarterly reports and market trends. On a rainy Sunday, Silas attended an art exhibition. One painting stopped him in his tracks, a wide, windswept coastline under a fiery sunset. The brushstrokes were raw and alive, not perfect but full of feeling. It reminded him of the freedom he used to dream about. Without thinking too much, he bought it. When he hung it in his office, his assistant asked why. "Because," Silas said with a smile, "it makes me remember where I want to go." While visiting the art center, Silas met an elderly woman named Marjorie who painted every week without fail. Her hands trembled from age, but her strokes were confident. She told him she had only started painting at 70. "It's never too late," she said, tapping her brush against the jar of water. That night, her words echoed in his mind. If Marjorie could start fresh at 70, surely he could too. The thought filled him with a strange, joyful determination. Silas had always kept a rigid routine at work, but he began delegating more tasks to his managers. At first, it felt wrong, as if he were abandoning his responsibilities. But slowly, he realized that giving others more control allowed him to step back and focus on what mattered to him. He also began clearing out his office, removing items that no longer inspired him. In their place, he kept books, art supplies, and a growing stack of notebooks. His office became less of a financial fortress and more of a creative space. One of the letters Silas had sent months ago finally got a reply. It was from Thomas, an old college friend he had lost touch with after a falling out. Thomas suggested they meet for coffee. Nervous but hopeful, Silas agreed. Their conversation was awkward at first, but as they talked about old times, the years melted away. They didn't erase the past, but they built a new bridge over it. Walking away, Silas felt lighter, as if some part of him had been repaired. On his way home one evening, Silas heard music drifting from a small bar. Inside, a woman was singing with a voice so full of emotion that it stopped him in his tracks. He stayed until the last note faded, feeling something inside him shift. He remembered that he used to play the guitar in college. The next day he bought one. It felt strange in his hands, but the moment he strummed the first chord, he felt that same spark from long ago. Silas booked a weekend trip to a coastal town he had always wanted to visit but never had time for. The ocean air was crisp, and the horizon stretched endlessly. He walked along the beach, collecting shells and jotting down thoughts in his notebook. There was no schedule, no pressure, just the steady rhythm of waves. He realized that life didn't need to be rushed. Sometimes the most important thing was to simply be present. The art center coordinator asked Silas if he would lead a writing workshop for the children. At first, he hesitated. He had never taught before, but he agreed, and the experience turned out to be one of the most rewarding moments of his new life. The children listened eagerly, their faces lighting up when he told them that their voices mattered. He realized he wasn't just rediscovering his own creativity. He was helping others find theirs too. Silas still had his struggles. There were days when old habits tried to pull him back, when the noise of the business world drowned out the whisper of his creative voice. But he kept choosing day after day to hold on to the compass he had found. It wasn't about sudden transformation or grand gestures. It was about the quiet victories. The poem finished, the letter sent, the afternoon spent sketching instead of calculating. He knew he was building something far greater than a company. He was building himself. But Silas had no idea that his small, quiet choices were setting him on a collision course with the most unexpected chapter of his life. A letter, a stranger, and an opportunity too wild to ignore would soon appear on his doorstep, forcing him to choose between the world he had built and the life he was beginning to love. Don't miss part 2. The invitation that changed everything.